everyone, welcome back to our Jean, Daya
And Giov,
podcast. Today, we're talking about the spread of colonial rule in Southeast Asia.
cool. So, what is this topic about?
So, in the 19th century, Southeast Asia became one of the most important regions in the world because Western powers began to colonize it.
And colonization means a powerful country takes control of another's country's land, people, economy, and government. So, like if someone came into your house and said, "This is mine now," it is just like job.
Whoa, that would be terrifying.
When Western powers colonized the Southeast Asia not by accident, but because the region had resources, locations, and people that could support the Western industrial growth.
And this process deeply changed Southeast Asia's economy, the politics, and society, and its effects are still today. So, why did Western powers colonize Southeast Asia? Jean and John, why?
Western colonization was driven mainly by economic and strategic reasons, especially during the Industrial Revolution.
And the important topics to cover are the raw materials, the markets, and also the strategic ports.
That would be so interesting, Jean. So let's start with raw materials. So during the Industrial Revolution, Western countries built many factories naman, di ba? So these factories needed a large and a constant supply for raw materials, am I right?
As Southeast Asia was rich in natural resources that were essential for industrial production.
And some important raw materials found in Southeast Asia included the rubber that is used for tires, machines, and industrial equipment, and tin used for food containers, tools, and machinery. And also the spices, which were very obviously valuable trade goods, and also the oil, which later became an essential for fuel and transportation.
So by colonizing Southeast Asia, Western powers could control these resources directly and extract them cheaply, am I right? And send them back to their own country. So basically, they were saying that we want your stuff and we want it now, something like that.
The European powers involved Britain, France, Netherlands, and United States.
And during the 19th century, the Southeast Asia became an important target for Western imperial powers, and these countries did not cooperate peacefully. Instead, they competed with one another to gain the land, the wealth, and also the influence.
So each Western power had its own style of rule, economic goals, and reasons for colonizing specific territories.
So let's start with Britain. Britain was the largest and the most powerful in the world during the 19th century. It already controlled the India and wanted to secure the nearby regions to protect its trade routes and expand its economy.
So, Britain focused on the territories that were economically profitable, which is the places with valuable raw materials, and also a strategically located, which is the important for ports and sea routes.
So basically, in Southeast Asia, Britain controlled areas like Malaya, Singapore, and Burma.
Yeah, the Britain main interest was not cultural conversion, but economic efficiency and stability. It wanted colonies that could supply raw materials for British factories. Second, serve as markets for British goods. And third is help protect Britain's trade routes to India and China.
So, Britain often preferred the indirect rule, which allowed local rulers to stay in place while the Britain controlled the trade, the taxes, and the foreign policy.
So this system helped Britain rule large areas with less cost and less rebellion, but is still denied through independence to local people, am I right? So basically, it is like letting someone keep their toy but telling them when and how they can play with it, am I right?
Yeah. And next is the France. France entered Southeast Asia largely to compete with Britain and to expand its global influence. French leaders believed that having colonies was a sign of national strength and prestige.
And the France controlled the Indochina, which included the Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
So the French believed strongly in direct rule. So French officials thought local societies were backwards and believed it was France's duty to first is to govern the colonies directly, to spread the French language, culture, and education, and of course to reshape colonial societies to be more French rather.
And because of this, no, and France replaced local rulers with French administrators. It imposed French laws and taxes. It controlled education and government.
So this system created a very strong resentment among the local people because they were excluded from the power and they're also heavily taxed.
Yeah, but however, it also created a small educated elite who later become leaders of the nationalist movements. Think of it like this, huh? It is like giving a few kids the answer key to eventually they used to fight it back.
And now the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies or in the Indonesian.
Yeah.
All right. Although the Netherlands was a small European country, it controlled one of the richest colonies in the world, known as the Dutch East Indies, which is present-day Indonesia.
So this colony became the backbone of the Dutch economy. Unlike Britain or France, the Netherlands was not interested in spreading the culture, the education, or the political institutions in its colony. So its primary and almost exclusive goal was profit.
So the Dutch viewed Indonesia as a giant economic machine designed to produce wealth for Europe.
And the Dutch government and private companies claimed ownership of large areas of land. Second is it controlled labor systems. And third is decided what crops farmers had to grow.
Jean, yes?
And one of the most important systems used by the Dutch was the cultivation system, where an Indonesian farmers they were forced to grow export crops instead of food crops. And these crops were included the sugar, coffee, and spices, which were very a high demand in Europe.
So the profits from these exports is first to strengthen the Dutch economy. Second is to help the fund development in Netherlands. And the third is did not improve the living conditions for Indonesians.
And for the local people, that a Dutch rule meant forced labor, where people had no choice but to work for the colonial government. Heavy taxation, which forced families into debt. Widespread poverty, despite living in resource-rich lands, and social inequality, where Europeans live comfortably while locals struggle.
And to maintain their control, the Dutch used a mix of direct rule and indirect rule. In some areas, the Dutch officials governed directly, but sa uban, the local rulers were allowed to remain, but only if they followed the Dutch orders.
These flexible systems allowed the Netherlands to rule efficiently while maximizing the profits and minimizing the resistance.
Finally, the United States and imperialism in Southeast Asia. The US entered imperialism later than European powers near the end of the 19th century. By this time, most of the Southeast Asia was already under European control.
And the US, they justified its imperial expansion using the ideas such as they bringing civilization para sa mga less developed societies. They also preparing colonies for their democracy and providing education and modernization.
And this justification was often called the civilizing mission, but in reality, it hid the same goals pursued by European empires.
Behind this moral language, the United States wanted first is new markets for American goods. Second is strategic military bases in Asia. and third is economic and political influence in the Pacific region.
And the Philippines became America's main colony in Southeast Asia after the US defeated the Spain in the Spanish-American War of 1898.
Although American leaders claimed they were helping Filipinos in practice the US, but first is to control the colonial government, second is to dominate the economy, and lastly is to suppress Filipino resistance using military force.
Filipino fought against US rule in the Philippine-American War, but their resistance was crushed.
And this clearly showed that the American imperialism, while different sila in language, was still imperialism in reality. They just focused on control, power, and to benefit the colonizer.
When Western power colonized Southeast Asia in the 19th century, they did not all rule in the same way.
However, despite differences in style, every colonial system had the same core goals. First is to maintain political control over the colony. The second is to prevent rebellion and resistance from local populations. And the third is to extract wealth and resources to benefit the colonizing country.
And to achieve this goal, Western empires developed a two main system of rule, the direct rule and indirect rule.
So this system shaped daily life, the political power, and economic structures in Southeast Asian societies.
Basically, whether it's direct or indirect, the locals didn't really get a say.
Exactly. History isn't just an old stuff. It's part of our story.
Thanks for listening, friends. Stay tuned for more fun and playful history next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast. Today, we're talking about the forms of the colonial control, the direct versus indirect rule in Southeast Asia.
Oh, it sounds serious, but don't
Yes.
worry, we'll make it super easy to understand.
Yes,
Yeah, let's start super simple. A long time ago, the big countries from Europe went to smaller countries in Southeast Asia.
and they did this because they wanted the gold, the crops, the oil, and the spices. Money, of course, and to control over land and trade.
So basically, they wanted it all.
And the big countries are called the colonizers, and the smaller countries they controlled are called colonies. To control these places, colonizers had two main ways.
And even though they look different, both ways were unfair. They are made to stay in power, stay people from fighting back, and to take resources.
Yikes, not very nice.
Imagine this, guys, huh? You live in your house, playing your favorite games, and suddenly a stranger comes and says, "This is my house now."
That's direct rule.
Yes.
Wait, seriously? So you can't even pick what to eat?
Exactly. So here's what happened in direct rule. The foreign people became the leaders. They made the rules, they took the taxes, they controlled the schools, and the local leaders had no power.
So local people could not decide anything for themselves. Imagine someone telling you that they want to do all day. No freedom at all. Am I right?
Yeah.
An example is French Indochina, Vietnam, which include the Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. France controlled everything.
France basically said, "You don't know how to rule yourselves. We will do it."
So ang France, first is to remove the local leaders. Second is to put French officials in charge and ignore the local culture and traditions.
No way, that's harsh.
Yep. People felt poor, angry, and unfairly treated.
But France also built schools. Some local people learned to read and think about freedom. So later, these educated people said, this is wrong, and we want our country back. Something like that.
Now imagine that stranger lets your parents stay in the house but tells them, "You must follow my rules."
That's indirect rule. Looks nicer, right? But it's still unfair, right?
Yeah, here's what happened. The local leader stayed, but they had to obey the colonizers. And colonizers made big decisions secretly. Then local leaders told people what to do.
So it's like your parents are still in charge, but only on paper.
Exactly. An example is the British Malaya. Britain let Malaya sultans stay in power.
But the train still controlled the money, the trade, and the resources.
The sultans had cool titles, but no real power.
British Malaya tin and rubber. Britain wanted tin and rubber for machines, the tools, the tires, and the cars. And also Britain built mines and rubber for plantations, bringing workers from China and India. And local rulers had little power and most money went to Britain. The local people worked hard but stayed poor.
So even though the direct and indirect rule looked different, both were really about keeping colonizers in power, they're taking resources, and also limiting the local freedom.
Yeah, basically unfair, no matter how you look at it.
Exactly. And understanding this helps us see why some parts of the Southeast Asia still feel the effects of colonization today.
History isn't just old stuff, it's part of our story.
Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast, and today we're talking about the impact of colonial rule in Southeast Asia.
Oh, that sounds interesting. So, what happened because of colonial rule?
So we can break it down into three main things: cash crop economies, the loss of sovereignty, and the growth of nationalist movements.
So first up, the cash crops economies. Farmers had to grow crops to sell abroad, like the rubber, the sugar, and the coffee.
Wow, so they were basically working for other countries instead of themselves.
Exactly, and these caused the hunger because less food was grown for local people.
And economies became dependent on global prices, which was risky if prices dropped. Like, imagine selling a lemonade only when the price is high. If the price drops, you go broke, man.
Ah, next, we have loss of freedom or sovereignty.
So the countries lost control over their leaders, the land, and also their decisions.
So colonizers made rules and took resources for themselves. Local people could not govern their own countries.
So, basically, someone else was the boss of everything. Talk about losing your remote control.
Now let's talk about nationalism. Some people got education from colonial schools.
They learn about the freedom, the equality, and rights.
And when they say how unfair colonial rule was, it inspired nationalist movement, which later fought for independence.
It's like they were saying, hey, we want our country back.
So the big picture, the colonizers came from money, resources, and power.
Life was hard for local people who work for foreign profit.
But the colonial rule planted the idea of freedom and resistance.
And this struggle helped to shape the modern Southeast Asia countries. So even though it was tough, it also sparked a desire for independence.
History really is a story of struggle and hope, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. That's why learning about it is very important.
Yes, right.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back to our podcast. And right now, we are talking or we are diving into empire building in Africa and analyzing the scramble for Africa and its long-term consequences.
Wow, that sounds heavy.
Yes.
We'll make it super clear. I promise. We'll
Yeah,
promise.
let's go bullet by bullet. So it's like a story, not just a lecture.
So the Industrial Revolution in Europe completely changed how countries produce goods, how they needed resources, and how they competed globally.
Factories were producing huge quantities of goods, textiles, machinery, tools, and more, which required materials that Europe did not have enough of.
And Africa became a perfect target because it was rich in resources like the rubber, the cotton, the palm oil, the gold, diamonds, copper, and even the ivory.
And Europeans also needed the new markets to sell their surplus goods. And Africa's populations became a captive market. So basically, no competition, easy sales.
And surplus European money needed places to invest. Mines, plantations, and railroads in Africa promised huge potential profits.
And plus, the Industrial Revolution technology let Europeans project military and administrative power far, far away. And the colonies became symbols of the national prestige.
Here we go with the key takeaways of this topic. The Industrial Revolutions didn't just create factories, it created a hunger for resources, for markets, and for global dominance, which fueled the scramble for Africa.
So Europeans didn't suddenly invade with armies. First, it invades through missionaries. Second, traders and explorers laid in groundwork.
Missionaries traveled to Africa to spread the Christianity and European values. The schools and hospitals were nice, but they were undermined African religions and traditions.
And traders opened commercial routes to bought the raw materials and sold the European goods. And their success often required military protection. So they basically turned parts of Africa into economic footholds.
Explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley charted rivers, lands, and resources. Their reports excited European governments and investors.
And their exploration turned Africa from a mysterious continent into a map of opportunity for profit and colonization.
Here we go, the key takeaways again. The missionaries, the traders, and explorers were first instruments of European control, preparing the way for full colonization.
African societies resisted bravely, but Europeans had the Maxim gun.
So it was invented in 1884. It was the world's first fully automatic machine gun, hundreds of bullets per minute.
A small European army could defeat large African armies, armed mostly with spears and outdated firearms.
So yeah, even the strong African kingdoms were quickly subdued. Brutal battles, power imbalance, and total chaos.
So the key takeaway here is that colonization wasn't just economic, it was heavily enforced by technology, which African societies couldn't overcome.
Europeans rushed into Africa and risked fighting each other, so they held the Berlin Conference.
And the shocking part is no African leaders were invited. So seriously?
Borders were drawn for European convenience and they were ignoring African realities.
So the conference legitimized the scramble for Africa. The key takeaway of here is that it was about Europe managing its competition, not Africa.
Colonial borders were often straight lines on a map, which ignores hundreds of ethnic groups.
And these caused two problems, the split of ethnic groups and the forced rivals together. Awkward, right?
Yeah.
So after independence, these borders led to political instability, the civil wars, and the ethnic conflicts. So the key takeaways of here are Giov.
Colonial borders were tools for Europeans, not African realities.
So here we go, the forced labor.
So the colonial powers were not interested in helping Africans. They wanted wealth.
So the forced labor. Africans were made to work in mines, plantations, or building railroads, so beaten or imprisoned if they refused.
And now the extraction economies. African colonies exported raw materials like rubber, cocoa, cotton, or minerals to Europe, and local industries discouraged.
So the key takeaways here is that colonial economies were not built for extraction, leaving Africa economically vulnerable.
So the Britain, the Egypts or the Suez Canal, and South Africa or the Golden Diamonds. The indirect rule, the local leaders stayed but Europeans controlled the real power.
In France, West and Central Africa, which is the direct route, because French officials made all decisions, African political power is minimal.
While in Belgium, the Congo Free State under the King Leopold II, they forced the rubber collection, the family punishments, and also millions died, which is a very brutal example.
The destruction and traditional societies. African kings, chiefs, and elders lost its power because customs and governance collapsed.
And the next is economic dependency. Economies relied on exporting raw materials. Few industries developed and poverty widespread.
Also, the foundations of modern conflicts, which is the artificial borders, the weak governance, and also the resource struggles and civil wars.
And the key takeaways of here are the colonialisms reshaped Africa economically, politically, and socially, which creating a challenges still for today. Hey everyone! Right now, we are diving into British rule in India, how Britain controlled India and its effects.
Oh wow! India's story is long and dramatic. Let's unpack it bullet by bullet so it's not scary.
Yeah, it's like peeling layers of a giant onion. Tear up a little, but learn from it.
The East India Company, or the EIC, was a private British trading company that gradually took control of large parts of India during the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Yeah, this started trading spices, cotton, silk, and indigo. But soon, they expanded into political and military power.
And they made treaties with local rulers, often forcing them to just accept British authority.
And get this, they had a private army to protect trade, interests, and defeat the local kingdoms that resisted.
Plus, they collected taxes through systems like the zamindari system, which enriched the company while burdening locals.
So the impact, the Indian rulers lost political control, the local economies served the British trade needs, and early resentment set the stage for later on the rebellions.
Example of that is the Battle of the Plassey in 1757. EIC defeated the Nawab of Bengal in this richest province. Talk about a power move.
So after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government took direct control and established a British Raj, which is in 1858 up to 1947.
So India was ruled by a viceroy representing the British monarch.
And Indian princes like Maharajas had limited autonomy but had to accept the British supremacy.
So the impact of this is that the political power centralized under the British officials. Laws served the British interests, not the Indian welfares.
Also called the Sepoy Mutiny, Indian soldiers rebelled due to cultural, religious, and economic grievances.
Yeah. Like cartridges greased with cow or pig fat, super offensive to Hindu and Muslim soldiers.
Poor pay and discrimination also added fuel to the fire.
And to spread across northern India, cities, princely states, and peasants all involved.
And its outcome is brutally suppressed. Thousands died, and Britain abolished EIC rule, which taking direct crown control.
So it officially began in 1858. India became a crown colony. Local princes retained the symbolic authority in some areas.
So Viceroy represented the monarch, British officers held government posts, and infrastructure was designed for British benefit.
And its impact are political control more efficient. The Indian society is still exploited economically and socially.
So here we go with the economic exploitation. India's economy was reoriented to serve the British industry. cotton and tea exported to Britain, opium to China.
Yeah. And traditional industries like handloom weaving collapsed under the British competition. Farmers forced into cash crops, which leads to famine.
And the impact of this is that India became a supplier of raw materials and a market for British products. And the local artisans and peasants, they were suffering.
The railways, the telegraphs, and canals were built to facilitate the trade and the move of troops.
Yeah, and its impact is modern transport is developed by primarily for British benefits. And railways unintentionally connected India and which later helped nationalist movements.
And the roads and canals also changed the agricultural economy.
So the English education was introduced to create a loyal class of intermediaries to help to govern.
Yeah, and British law replaced traditional legal systems, and Western ideals and Christianity were promoted in schools.
And the impact of this is that the educated elite they emerged, and understanding both the Indian traditions and the British systems is that the cultural displacement occurred as a local customs were very undermined.
So the emergence of educated elite, Indian students and professionals began questioning the British authority.
And early nationalist movements formed, like the Indian National Congress in 1888, and it demands reforms.
And the impact here is that it laid groundwork for later independence movements, including the Mahatma Gandhi's campaign, and also resistance was both violent and non-violent. It was inspired by democracy, equality, and self-rule.
So India's economy served Britain, the traditional industries destroyed.
And the social, English education, and Western legal systems, it created a small elite but displaced traditional culture.
And for the political aspect, the centralized administration left Indians without the real power. They were just inspired nationalist movements.
So here we go, the infrastructure, railways and communication modernized India mainly for the British Army.
And lastly, its legacy is patterns of inequality, economic dependency, and social division persisted after independence.
And that's the British rule in India in a nutshell. Heavy stuff, right? But understanding it just shows why India's history is so rich and also complex.
Exactly. History isn't just about dates. It is people, power, and consequences.
In the next episode, we can compare India, Africa, and Southeast Asia and see the global patterns of imperialism.
Perfect.
So right
Here's a
now,
short
we're talking about the British rule in India, how Britain controlled it, and what happened.
Yeah, India's story is huge, but we'll keep it short and juicy.
Yeah, like a history snack, right? Learn fast and no brain cramps.
So the EIC started with spices, the cotton, the silk, and the indigo, then grabbed the political power.
They made treaties collecting taxes through zamindari system, and they had private army.
And the impact here is that the Indian rulers became puppets. Economy, they served the Britain, and also the early resentment brewed.
So example of that is the Battle of Plassey, as what I've mentioned earlier, in 1757. EIC took Bengal, India's richest province.
So after the 1857 rebellion, Britain took direct control. Hello, British Raj.
Viceroy ruled, and princes had limited power, and also the British officers they ran the government.
And the impact of that is that the centralized power, the laws, and infrastructure for British benefit, not the locals.
Its key policies. First is the economic exploitation. Cotton and tea exported, opium to China. Traditional industries collapsed, no? Which means to famine.
And also the infrastructure, railways, the canals, the telegraphs, which is the modern but for British trade and troops.
Here we go to social change. English education created a small elite, Western ideals promoted, and some cultural displacement.
Educated Indians questioned British rule. Indian National Congress, which is formed in 1885, they demand reforms.
And it set the stage for independence movements, including Gandhi's non-violent campaigns.
So the long-term effects of this are the economy sort of retained, the traditional industries destroyed.
Socially, small elite emerged and culture displaced.
And politically, centralized rule left Indians without real power, inspiring nationalism.
And history lesson is that power, control, and resistance shape the modern world.